Honorable panelists, welcome to another webinar uh, from Global and Regional Studies Center at IoBM. This is our monthly webinar that we hold on important international and national issues. Today, we have a very important subject to discuss, and we have two very eminent panelists who have kindly honored this occasion. The subject that we're going to discuss is titled The Israeli Invasion of Gaza, the Unfolding Humanitarian Catastrophe, its ramifications for the peace and security in the Middle East, and policy options for Pakistan. And we are joined today by Ambassador Najmuddin Sheikh Sahab, who does not need any introduction. He's an eminent diplomat who has served Pakistan, who is internationally known, who has served Pakistan in several embassies, High Commissioner to Canada, Ambassador to Germany, Ambassador to USA, and Ambassador to Iran, been a Foreign Secretary. He also has been President's Special Envoy. He sits on several think tanks. I think this small this too short an introduction, but I think everybody knows which number is here and abroad. Similarly, we have Ambassador Mustafa Kamal Kazi, again, another very eminent Pakistani diplomat who has served Pakistan as ambassador in Russia to Russian Republic, Kingdom of Netherlands, Iraq, Indonesia, and of course he has served in Pakistan as additional foreign secretary. He sits on several policy boards and think tanks. Ambassador Najmuddin Sheikh Sahab, Ambassador Mustafa Kamal Kazi Sahab, you are welcome to this to the webinar today. I think we all have seen the havoc played by Israeli forces with the Palestinian lives. They have destroyed homes. They have made hundreds and thousands of people homeless. More than 230 children, men, women, men, old and young have died. And it was kind of, they say, as the Secretary General said, that if you want to see hell on earth, literally, you could go and see the child in Gaza. So it was for 11 to 12 days was hell on earth indeed. God thanks that hell on earth, that at least a ceasefire has been agreed to. But will it hold? That's a big question that we are looking at. But more than that, I think we have to look at the root causes of the recurrent these sporadic, recurrent, regular slaughters by Israel, from Shatila camps to several other invasions of Gaza. Every 5 to 10 years, they go and invade Gaza and they kill Palestinians at will, and the international community in general and the Islamic and Arab world in particular sees just in silence. But this time around, at least that silence has been broken. The world seems to have spoken out and enough. So this change that was discernible. So we'll also discuss that. But today's subject, I thought we will have 4 or 5 dimensions to discuss. One is the causes of the latest Israeli invasion, whether it was Netanyahu's personal agenda as well to prolong and distract his voters from his corruption. Second, why the recently concluded Abraham Accords, which was they were signed with such a big fanfare and were touted as to be the guarantee for bringing peace in the Middle East, and especially between Israelis and Palestinians. It did not have an iota of impact on the even current crisis. Second, why there's still continued inability of US to prevail on Israel to not to indulge in these humanitarian violations and this apartheid and this slaughter of Palestinians. And of course, the response of the world in general and of the Muslim Arab world in particular, the Israeli aggression has been not that effective, that does not really enough pressure on Israel that it stops at will, it achieves certain objectives, political and military, only then it stops. And finally, of course, we as sitting in Pakistan would like to give some recommendations to our government. So, what are the policy options for Pakistan? Now, may I invite Ambassador Sheikh Saab to give his opening remarks, followed by then Mustafa Kamal Kazi Sahab, and then we can go on for a question and answer session. Sheikh Saab, over to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Rasool. It is kind of you to invite me to this webinar. I'm afraid that much as one would like to paint a more optimistic picture, it seems to me that the picture is rather grim, and the prospects of something uh, beneficial for the Palestinian people emerging from this latest 11 days of crisis and 11 days of ceaseless bombardment uh, uh, seem to be very, very limited. What has happened, in my view, is that President Biden and his administration, who say that they have been very deeply engaged, they talked about the fact that there have been more than 80 exchanges that they had uh, from the president down to the rather low level delegate that they had earmarked for talks on the ground. Amir Hadi, there seems to me that though these 80 exchanges took place, there was one message that was common to everything that they did, which was that Israel has the right to defend itself, that whatever actions Israel is taking have been defensive in nature and not been the cause. Now, in this, they ignore the fact that this really started. In fact, I was reading an interesting story that this really started on 13th April. And I'll ask why 13th April. 13th April was the first day of Ramadan. It is a day that is marked specially in Al Aqsa. And that day, President of Israel chose to speak because it was also a day that commemorated 70 years of Israel. And so Israeli troops went into Al-Aqsa, cut off the mics that had been fixed there and the wires that had been fixed there for the Al-Aqsa Ramzan celebration. And as a result, uh, the Palestinians were not able to observe that day. And this, in one New York Times story, it was identified as being one of the first trigger points for what happened subsequently. That all the trials and tribulations that the Palestinians have been subject to, this one was added to and was one that perhaps acted as a catalyst for the events that followed. Now, what are the events that follow? I mean, let us look at it. It seems that the Gaza Strip, what is it, 336 square kilometers, uh, perhaps by an estimate, 2 million people have been living under siege all this time. They are dependent for their food, etc., on convoys from Israel. They have a border with Egypt, which uh, tends to be closed more often than not, and even now is under strict control. And therefore, they are highly dependent. Their leader, Ismail Haniyeh, is of course in Qatar, but obviously they have good coordination, good communication, and so the reports suggest that more than 4,000 rockets were fired at Israel. Uh, some of them also were fired at Jerusalem, but those are few and far between. Most of them were fired at Israel and caused the big damage they caused was that 10 people died. Uh,
10
uh, and two Thai workers died. This was the total damage. In Gaza, uh, by one count, now the latest count is perhaps higher, but 283 people died, 1,900 people were injured, and virtually all facilities were being destroyed as you went along. The one center that they had for COVID was destroyed. Many hospitals were destroyed. A building that housed the media, AP and Al Jazeera, was hit and collapsed. Therefore, they were able to continue to transmit, but that building was also hit, and the Israelis claimed, without offering more evidence, that this is where the Hamas had its offices also. In any case, these are tiny details, but these tiny details matter in terms of establishing that Israel has some of the most advanced intelligence on what was happening in Gaza, and could aim its rockets and its bombardment precisely at the targets that they wanted. Their superiority in terms of the weapons that they have, in terms of the intelligence that they have, is undoubted. And yet, on the other side, you had from the Americans only one uh, recurrent message, which was that Israel has a right to defend itself, that we are very happy that Israel has agreed to the unconditional ceasefire, that this is a step that they have taken that we welcome, and that we are now. If you look at the speech that President Biden made, a 3-minute speech that he made when he refused to take any questions, what were the points that he made? The first point he made was that Israel has a right to defend itself. Second, that we want the people of the Palestinian people and the Israeli people uh, to have complete lives of their own. Uh, but he refused to say that he would pursue the two-state solution. Instead, more and more, the message that came across was that the two-state solution is no longer viewed as viable in Washington. And this problem was multiplied by the manner in which they continued later on with saying that now we will continue to support Israel's right to defend itself. We will continue our talks. We welcome Egyptian mediation. We also welcome the fact that along with us, Qatar and other Arab countries will help to rebuild Gaza, but no talk of pursuing a two-state solution. And Israeli extremists, not just extremists, but even those who are not considered extremists, have been very critical of the fact that this ceasefire was arrived at with one former ambassador to the United States, Martin Orange, suggesting that, for God's sake, why have you stopped? You should have continued till the end. And this is a recurring theme in the statements that have been emerging from the right-wing extremists. What is the main point that one has to address here? Netanyahu was on the verge of being thrown out of office, being tried for corruption. And suddenly, with this particular incident, Netanyahu has emerged as the prime minister of the day. If there are elections, and I think an election will be called, it is likely that he will lead his section of the Likud party to victory and will continue to stay prime minister, so that the break that many people were expecting, that Netanyahu was at one time a supporter of a two-state solution, a lukewarm supporter, but he had supported it. Now it is clear that he is looking for one thing. He is looking for Ersatz Israel. Now, what do I mean by Ersatz Israel? Ersatz Israel means that the whole of the West Bank, all this area, will be termed as Ersatz Israel, and those Arabs, those Israeli Arabs who stay on, will stay as second-class citizens, or in the perception of most extremists in Israel, will be helped to move to Jordan. This is, I think, what they have in mind. Let me stop here, and maybe we can go on.
Okay, thank you, sir. I think I'll come back to you with some questions from your statement before, so that I give you a lead on that. Whether is the end of two-state solution really now not a possibility? Probably come back to you on this question. In the meantime, sir, may I request Ambassador Mustafa Kamal Kazi to come up with his opening statement, and then we can follow up with questions. Ambassador Saab, please.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Baluch, for having me on this panel. My greetings also to Ambassador Najmuddin Sheikh, who has given us very comprehensive perspective on the latest Israeli onslaught and its repeated use of indiscriminate use of force. The violence in Palestine has produced heart-rending images and statistics. In my view, what is unfolding is a tragic twist to the story of Germany before the Holocaust. Israel is the only country in the world which is still not defined its national territory. What actually and in reality defines Israel are the expressions such as occupation, apartheid, secular colonialism, and ethnic cleansing. It is not a country or a state, but basically a colonial project. What has happened? I mean, the events that has happened, they're all well known. Clearly, Israel's sinister aim is to impose ethnic supremacy in occupied Palestine and to crush Palestinians into ghettos and with inhuman efficiency. Not only that, it also wants to subjugate neighboring countries and dominate the entire region. Besides the historical baggage and usual propensity to crush and subjugate Palestinians, the intensity and brutality of the latest Israeli onslaught appears to have been influenced by four factors. First, Netanyahu's inability to form new government, as Ambassador Najmuddin Sheikh mentioned, Ibrahim Accords, and then continued unqualified support to Israel by the Biden administration or all US administrations. Netanyahu's inability to form the new government I'll take up first. For the past 2 years, Netanyahu has been fighting his political, fighting for his political life, whatever survival he has. He has been charged with fraud and corruption, as Ambassador Najmuddin mentioned, and is potentially facing hefty prison sentence if he falls from power. Like his predecessor, former Prime Minister Olmert, who's, I think, recently been released from jail, having spent many years there. Now, of course, this will be, the opposition, the change bloc, which is called, the opposition, the new coalition that was emerging, the change bloc had mustered a good number of parliamentarians to form the government. They needed four more parliamentarians to reach the number of 61, which is the majority in the parliament, simple majority. And those four votes were to come from a Palestinian-Israeli camp party who had agreed to support the government. So they were in the process, and in the meanwhile, Netanyahu engineered all this, and this was engineered just at the start of Ramadan, as you could see, and Ambassador Najmuddin mentioned that the start date was 1st of Ramadan. And then what happened at Masjid al-Aqsa and all the provocation and the expulsion of, Palestinians living in the Sheikh Jarrah quarter of the East Jerusalem. So now, of course, the Palestinian group can't support the coalition government that was in process of formation. So obviously it falls on Netanyahu to take over, and then possibly if he's not having the full majority and governable majority, then Israel will go for another election. And then what really shows that it's not only the personality of Netanyahu, but the public and the mood of the electorate, that the killing of Palestinians energizes the entire Israeli or majority of Israeli public opinion. This is very, something of great concern. And the question is that there has to be a distinction between, when we are evaluating the events, between the occupier, occupied, oppressor, oppressed, and recently even the Human Rights Watch, which is basically a darling of Western countries, has come up with a very scathing report condemning Israeli actions in the occupied Palestine, and also in the whole, and terming it as crimes against humanity and war crimes, and fit enough to be tried by the International Court of Justice. So that is on the Abraham Accord. These accords raise very, very serious questions. Basically 4 countries, Arab countries, have signed our party. The UAE and Bahrain were the pioneers, and subsequently Morocco joined, but Morocco in exchange got the US recognition for its claim on Western Sahara, and Sudan, which got relaxation from the US sanctions. So they had something to take away straight away with by signing these agreements. But what UAE and Bahrain got is something that raises question, and is still a question mark. I don't know what really they got. And then look at the the demographic statistics. The UAE has indigenous population, native population of 2.5 million, and Bahrain has indigenous population of 700,000 only. And here are these 2 countries speaking in the name of Islam, Christianity, and Judaism. I don't know what right these 2 tiny countries have to speak in the name of Islam, the Islamic world, which numbers more than 1.5 billion people. So basically, I think this also raises a lot of other questions on the Arab League and Arab League members. There are 22 Arab League members, out of which 6 have been crippled by conflicts, invasions. And basically the Arab League was constituted and formed to protect the territorial integrity and to promote cooperation amongst the member states. Now, this is the performance of Arab League, and I think the Arab states have to put their heads together and do some soul searching. Why they fall such easy, victims to fratricidal conflicts and also foreign invasions. And then there is another question that Arab League or the Arab world, there are countries which are populous, which have historical heritage also, but they have been overtaken by the small Gulf states in terms of exercise of power. It is something like EU policies being decided by Andorra, Liechtenstein, Monaco, not France and Spain and Germany. This is a asymmetrical situation here, the power potential, and that also, this creates a lot of imbalances And I think this is also one of the causes of destabilization within the Arab world. So I end there, and then we can perhaps have more questions. Yeah. Yes, Ambassador Rasool. Well, probably I can go on. You can talk of.
You can unmute yourself. Answer.
Hello.
Okay, Ambassador Mustafa Kamal Kazi Sahab, thank you. I think we got lost the connection in the middle. I think you brought in home some very important, pertinent questions. Particularly, I think it is about the nature of the Israeli state, how it was found and how it's now being done. So, Ambassador Najmuddin Sheikh Sahab, I think there is also a battle of narratives. Israel now poses itself as a Jewish state supported by Christianity, which is up against a huge ummah. And we probably also are playing in their hands. Isn't it Israeli question, or even the Israeli-Palestinian issue now, a question of geopolitics, a question of international law, is a question of how the international system should work and how states should behave with their citizens as well as with their neighbors. How to disentangle this question or confusion of narratives? Najmuddin Sheikh Sahab, I'll request you to give your point of view, and then I'll come on to Mr. Mustafa Kamal Kazi. So I think the bottom line, it is about narratives. Yes, sir.
Well, I think that right now you must accept that the evangelicals in the Christian world, and I emphasize Christian world, but particularly in the United States of America, there is this belief that the second coming, for the second coming, Israel is where the second coming will occur, and therefore there is support for Israel from the Christians. Well, all three Abrahamic religions, be it Christianity, be it Judaism, or be it Islam, all grew from the same source. But they have found this new linkage between Judaism and Christianity, which is being propagated very, very strongly among the evangelicals, primarily in the United States, but also in Europe. Now, this is part of the narrative, in my view, of what Israel represents. But to turn to another facet, now you talked about, and Ambassador Kazi very eloquently talked about the fact that you're having small countries representing the will of the bigger countries in the Arab League. You're talking about them being the talking about what they can do. I think that we underestimate the degree to which the wealth of the countries in question is in play. The Gulf Cooperation Council was put together in 1981. It was put together primarily because at that time there was enough of a quarrel between Iran and Iraq, so that these countries could go ahead with this without the interference that in the past had kept them from getting together. Now, this Gulf Cooperation Council has evolved into something that may have been regarded as inconceivable in earlier days. Now, you talk about the fact that today the Saudi have an agreement whereby overflights by the Israeli airline are permitted, and that tourism traffic flows from Saudi Arabia to Israel and vice versa. Now, these are things that are things that you have to take account of. You have to take account of the fact that Saudi Arabia has a particular view of where its financial interests, where its economic interests lie. And in those, I think they are beginning to find that as their relationship with the United States becomes more questionable because of perhaps the inquiries with regard to Jamal Khashoggi, that they are looking for other opportunities while maintaining their very strong defense commitments. As you may have noted, when Secretary Blinken was making his calls, one of the things that he stressed in terms of both Saudi Arabia and in terms of the UAE was that the defense agreements that had been reached would be, or those that had been approved, the sales that have been approved, would be carried through. Now, these are things that these countries regard as important for themselves. Of course, at this time, there is a lot of ferment. There are prospects of some sort of, if not agreement, at least some sort of negotiations between Iran and Saudi Arabia, between Iran and the UAE. But these are prior to this 11-day period of crisis. And right now, the question that is going to arise is, in my view, the question that is going to arise is, what is the Arab street going to do? Are you going to have Arab people in the street rising to press their governments to take a harsher position vis-a-vis Israel? Currently, I'm not sure that there is movement in that particular direction. Now, this may be due to the hold that the governments have, but it may also be due to the fact that, let us be honest, the Palestinians have not been people who are well liked by their Arab brethren. They have not been. Yasser Arafat and some of the activities that were undertaken at that time were not well regarded. You have now Abbas, who's somebody put it well that he is in the 16th year of his 4-year term. There have been no elections. There have been nothing which suggests that the Mahmoud Abbas and the PA, the Palestinian Authority, are moving towards more democratization, which would be necessary if they were to counter the hold that Hamas has in Gaza. This is not happening. There is, in these circumstances, can we see the Arab street reacting strongly? So far, there is nothing to suggest that that is happening. And frankly, I've watched as closely as possible. Particularly, Al Jazeera has been doing a very good job of covering events in that area. I have not seen anything that suggests that there have been large demonstrations or large gatherings protesting the onslaught on Gaza or any steps that have been taken. What we have seen, however, is that the Israeli Arabs, those who live in Israel and in what Israel considers to be its own territory rather than illegally occupied territory, that for them, it seems to me that in many parts, they form between 20 to 30% of the population. Theoretically, they live side by side with their Jewish neighbors, and theoretically, they have good relations with these neighbors. But in virtually every city on which a report has appeared, it seems that now the extremist Jews are persecuting their neighbors, their Arab neighbors. And in any case, it is clear that the rights of the Arabs in Israel are very restricted. One example of this, Ambassador Kazi talked about Sheikh Jarrah. Now in Sheikh Jarrah, if there's going to be a decision that these people who are now occupying areas, occupying houses in Sheikh Jarrah must be evicted because they have not paid their rents. This does not apply to the Israelis. Israelis have not paid their rents for years and years, but they are exempt from this requirement. But if, as the Supreme Court will probably decide, I think Israel at the moment has decided to put off the decision by the Supreme Court, but I'm sure that the Supreme Court decision will be that these are houses that are illegally occupied by Palestinians, and they must be given over. When this happens, there will be more turbulence, more strife, but that will not change the situation on the ground, because the ability of the Israeli Arab or of the Arab in East Jerusalem is extremely limited. East Jerusalem as the capital of the Palestinian state, which was to be established, now looks like a distant dream. Now it does not look to me as though the possibility of a Jewish of a Palestinian state emerging. It's becoming more and more of a mirage. It hasn't since 1967 and the declaration that this is occupied territory and that this must be rectified, that there must be a Palestinian state with contiguous areas, etc., etc. Now this is becoming more and more of a mirage. It seems unlikely that this is going to come to fruition.
Right.
So this is the situation in which we find ourselves.
Right. May I now request, if you look at it, sir, it appears that the Muslim world or the Arab world is in disarray. One of the reason, of course, we all discussed was that there is no common thread to our narrative. It varies. There's a disconnect between the street, Muslim street, and the leadership. So, and there's a whole vacuum in terms of Arab leadership to have a concerted effort and a common stance towards Israel and its atrocities against Palestinians. In fact, there is a suspicion among the between the Palestinian leadership and the other Arab leadership, as you pointed out correctly. So now there is an attempt by Turkey, Pakistan, and some other Muslim countries to really try to fill up that leadership vacuum. You think there is a possibility that Mr. Tayyip Erdogan, with his great intentions, good oratory, and our own Prime Minister, Mr. Imran Khan, supported by some other countries, can really make a difference in terms of coming up with a common stance towards Israel and towards ultimate solution of the Palestinian-Israeli relation, including the establishment of an really independent Palestinian state. Mustafa Kamal Kazi Sahab, may I have your views on that?
Firstly, I agree that there is a tremendous distaste in the Arab world for any freedom struggle. Basically, the Arab leaders had hijacked the cause of Palestinians and used it for their own domestic purposes and for their own, leadership egos. And thankfully now, that's not the situation anymore. And the struggle is now back in the Palestinian hands, where it should be legitimately. Nobody fights for somebody else's freedom, but the people have to do it themselves. We know it from our own experience with the colonialism, and the rest of the world so also. And I think that is what is going to produce results. If you see the population, both the Arab and the Israeli and the Palestinians, they are equally shared. 6 million on one side, 6 million plus on one side, 6 million plus on the other side, Israel and Palestinians. And 20% of Israel's population are, they are the Palestinian Israelis, you see. So there is a demographic, situation, which can only be controlled by this apartheid, by this discriminatory system. And that, I think, is now in what the kind of times that we're living in is quite an obsolete thing. Even we knew in the 90s and 80s in South Africa, apartheid system, how it fell apart. And again, in Rhodesia, which is Zimbabwe, how it collapsed. And of course, there is kind of neocolonialism that has always existed. And even we, who were one of the first beneficiaries of in freedom, getting freedom from the colonials, we have been victims of different kind of entrapment. So that is, and then now the other factor is that the global situation, the global scenario is vastly changing with the rise of China, which is being underestimated at times. But then one can see from the desperation in the West, US and other Western countries that how much they are really concerned and how much they would want to invent, crisis and situations for China. And yesterday's interview with the foreign minister talked about, not the, on the Israel-Palestine situation, the interviewer took him to a corner, ambushed him, but then came on the situation with the Uyghurs, Chinese Uyghurs. So, that is, but this is not going to last. Technology doesn't remain exclusive to any particular geographical border, area. It passes very quickly, those who aspire for it. So I think now with the social media, the mainstream media is losing its importance everywhere in the world. And then if you see the Al Jazeera, for instance, it has a very nice coverage of the recent crisis. And then Russian television, RT, tremendous, So there is a lot of diffusion. First, before we were only, captive to the Western media. Now there is dispersion. Along with the dispersion with the mainstream medias of different, countries and different regions, there is social media and the new generation that is coming up that is not going to see the world and especially the Arab, Palestinian Israeli question in terms of the Christian evangelist in the United States or the Jewish and Christian eschatology. These are, I think, obsolete. People are now living in totally different times, this young generation. So I see that the doing away with two-state solution is going to be very, very basically detrimental to the Israeli interest, you see. And the one-state solution, they cannot keep, Palestinians captive to the apartheid system in this age and time. And then if people decide to really sacrifice and pay, give the kind of pay the cost that is necessary for freedom, gaining the freedom, they always succeed. So I think in the long run, I'm not talking in the immediate future, I'm talking in say 10 years or 15 years from now, I think not only, Palestine, but Israelis might face a situation where many may have to leave the region, because you can't be a transplant like that. You have to blend with the region, you have to blend with the people. Like if you see the Islam Mughals invaded India and they ruled for so many 100 years, they blended with the people, they became part of the civilization. And even Mongols, what they did, they blended, they converted to Islam. So without blending with the environment, with the people, who are 50% of the area which you want to control, I don't think you can stay. And those who will manage to stay will be the ones who will like to live in peace and tranquility and amity with the other brothers.
Great. I think it's a very positive note in terms of long term. But I want to again go back a bit to our own region. if you look at it in the world, the decolonization process, if at all, has stalled at two places, Palestine and Kashmir. Unfortunately, the present government of India has taken a lot of lessons. In fact, according to some reports, have advisors as to how to suppress the Kashmiri freedom struggle. And somehow, unintentionally, a nexus was built between the Kashmiri struggle and the Palestinian struggle. We have been invoking this similarity, but there was kind of resentment even among some Arabs as well. Of course, India would not support it, but it is but natural that in this connected world where everybody sees it, it cannot be, there'll be one set of rules, international rules for one set of people under occupation, and the same rules would not apply to other people under occupation. So I think there are implications of what happens in Palestine for our people, the Kashmiris, under the Indian occupation. So, sir, how do you see the international system really responding to this yearning, this aspiration of Kashmiris, and the case that we have been building and presenting to the world uh, uh, to give the international, I mean, apply the same rules with the Kashmiris. Why there's, I mean, our of course hearts bleed when even one Palestinian dies or one Kashmiri dies, but literally I don't see that much of even international media when the blood of Kashmiris is split, sort of flown in the streets of Srinagar. So how do we really look at it as Pakistanis, because it is the heart and soul of Pakistan's foreign policy and our statehood as well to some extent. So it's a very complicated question. Perhaps I've not been able to express what my deep feelings are, but I think you understand what I mean. So,
Well, let me go back to essentials first. First, please let's recognize that the first call to a Muslim country that Secretary Blinken made was a call to Shah Mahmood Qureshi Sahab. And what he said in that call was that we will talk about Afghanistan, we will talk about increasing our defense collaboration, we will talk about increasing our trade, and nary a mention from Secretary Blinken of Israel or of the crisis that was on at that particular time. What was the signal? The signal was that this is a problem between Israel and the Arabs. This is not a Muslim problem. This is the signal that they were passing across to you. Second, I think we should recognize that when we talk about Israel and Kashmir, this is something that we've been attempting to do over a long time. Now, I don't want to go into more details of this, but let us say that the reception that you have been accorded by your Muslim brethren, including and primarily your Arab brethren, has not been as forthcoming as you would have liked it to be, nor do they particularly join in seeing a parallel. I'm being very blunt and very clear because I think in our foreign policy, we have to be realistic and recognize the realities on the ground. So you have that particular situation now. When you talk about Turkey and Pakistan and other Muslim countries joining together, you've seen what President Erdogan is saying. President Erdogan retains his relationship with Israel. He is trying to use that relationship to try and ease some of the problems. But again, his is a peripheral rule, and that is not really going to be very effective in terms of doing things together. The two largest Muslim countries outside the Arab world are Pakistan and Indonesia. So far, From Indonesia, you had a degree of silence at the official level. You have had people of the particularly Islamist groups in Indonesia talk about launching protests, etc. But otherwise, in terms of the Muslim world, and in the Muslim world, you can include the ASEAN countries, the Brunei, etc. But none of them have reacted, as far as I can see. Perhaps I have missed some coverage, but I have not seen anything that suggests that there is a great deal of emphasis there. Now, to come back to the principal question, where are we headed? Where is this particular problem headed? And I see more and more that none of them, none of the Arab countries are moving away from the Abraham Accords. The reaction in the streets in Arab countries has not been what one would have liked to see. Is there an acquiescence? Is there a quiet understanding that this is how things are going to be in the future? I fear so. And that is what we should be prepared to look at. So let me sum up my views. I would like to say to Ambassador Kazi, aapke muh mein ghee shakkar, in the hope that within 10 years or maybe 15 years, the situation will change. That technology will bring about that greater media coverage will bring about changes. The truth is that media coverage is fine, but the hard realities on the ground prevail. You are not, public opinion is not a factor in the determination of policy. Today, Senator Sanders can talk about the fact that stop the $735 million worth of weapons that you're prepared to sell. Claim Rashid, the Palestinian member of the House of Representatives, a Palestinian herself, has advocated a one-state solution. She has advocated this one-state solution on the basis that if this remains a one-state, in a few years, the Arab Israelis will far outnumber the Jews, and this will become an Arab state. What she does not realize is that Netanyahu is quite aware of this. Netanyahu is going to make sure that as he moves towards Israel, he moves towards also expelling or reducing to second, no, perhaps third-class status the Arab Israelis that remain. Can this be stopped? We can make every effort. We should make every effort, but we should realize that this is a very hard struggle in which the chances of success are limited. You talked about China. Let us say that China has a relationship with Israel that is important to China. I think the exports over $6 billion, but the $6 billion is in technology, is the sort of area in which China seeks to benefit from the advances that Israel has made, and for exchanges at that particular level between the scientists on both sides to advance technologically. None of our Arab countries, unfortunately, have that base of technology advance that could make them attractive partners for technology exchanges. I don't think that China is looking to the UAE or to now, perhaps the UAE is moving in that direction, but it's still a very far cry. When Nemo comes into existence, the planned city that Prince Mohammed bin Salman has planned, when that comes to reality, when something along those lines happens, perhaps there will be. But that is as I agree with Ambassador Kazi, that lies very much in the future, but is not something that reflects the hard realities of today. So let me sum up. I think my view that currently the one state solution is the one-state solution that is being pursued. The two-state solution is now receding into the background, perhaps never to be resurrected. What will happen? There will be more turbulence, there will be more crises, and this whole region will continue to be involved in that particular operation. But Hamas capacity has been severely damaged. Let us recognize that. Biden says that he will help with the reconstruction of Gaza and Palestine, but with clear understanding that none of this should benefit Hamas. Now, how he is going to do that, I don't know, but they have the intelligence resources to be able to enforce something of this nature. Hamas says that it has received guarantees with regard to the actions that Israel will take in Sheikh Jarrah and options on reducing tension, etc. And Israel has denied that, has said that the ceasefire was unconditional. There were no concessions made to Hamas. So we must recognize that in military terms, this has been a story for a long time. Israel is the dominant force in that region. It is sufficiently dominant so that it does not even not only control its immediate neighborhood, but is able to try and take out Iranian assets in Syria. It is able to keep a watch on the Persian Gulf and on the movement there and on the movement of Israeli ships there or of Iranian ships there. It is able to see to help the Americans to enforce their blockade on Iranian oil exports. So this is the recognition of the reality that exists today. Perhaps I can share Ambassador Kazi's hope that this will change in 10 to 15 years. But currently, and it is unfortunately the situation that we have to deal with now, this seems to be a relatively rare possibility.
Thank you, sir. I think very interesting concluding remarks that change. Yes, I'll just add in what you said that unless the Arabs and Muslims are ready for that change may not be in favor of that party, which is not ready for change. Ambassador Mustafa Kamal Kazi, can we have your last concluding remarks with some recommendations for Pakistan, especially because that is very important that in the short term or mid-term or in the long term, of course, one doesn't know. But in the short term, what we need to do it so that our vital interests are protected and we still remain to continue to play a positive role in promoting peace and security in the Middle East, and of course setting those rules which can later be also be helpful to us with regard to our Kashmir policy. Ambassador Mustafa Kamal Kazi sahab.
I fully agree with Ambassador Najmuddin Sheikh to description of the situation that he has made. Of course, the freedom struggle can only be fought by the people themselves who are affected by it primarily, and the rest is all, all a story, chorus, a song, but basically the main script is the people who are, who have to fight for their own freedom. For Pakistan, I think we have very long established policy on this subject, starting from Quaid-e-Azam Muhammad Ali Jinnah, his position, and subsequently we have done, and the role that we have played to support freedom struggles in entire Muslim world, particularly in the Arab world. So we carry on and we support. We are not in a position to, give anything substantive except for diplomatic and political and declaratory support. That's about all. And but one thing for sure, that we have to keep away from any suggestion to recognize this right in the present circumstances. And there has been some talk, and there's been even some pressure from some countries in the area. But I think that will be we are not in a situation. Our public opinion would never permit it. And for the sake of stability in Pakistan, we should never go in that direction. Thank you. I think the time is up.
Thank you. I think extremely valuable discussion, although it's such a discussion which can go for hours, but definitely we touched upon strategic, short-term, mid-term, and long-term scenarios and various policy options which are available to Muslim world, to Arab world, and of course the depth that the two senior diplomats have it. I think it was very, very useful discussion. I'm really grateful to you, Ambassador Sheikh Saab, Ambassador Mustafa Kamal Kazi Saab. This dialogue goes on, and thank you for all the audience who were online with us. We come to an end. Allah Hafiz. Thank you very much. Peace to the world. Peace to all the oppressed people in the world. Thank you. Thank you.